Okay, so we are here on the Honoring Her Spark podcast, episode number 2. Today we're going to be talking about cultural safety and racism. And today we have our lovely guests, Roman Young, who works at Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan, and co-host Alicia Buckley, who also is the boss lady over at Saskatchewan. So I am going to give the floor over to Alicia and Roman. I'm Jordan Burnoff. I'm one of your co-hosts of the Honoring Her Spark podcast. I am from Black Lake First Nation, grew up in Isle Cross in northern Saskatchewan, and kind of living between the two in Saskatoon and Isle Cross. And I'm happy to be a part of this podcast. So without further ado, I will let Roman and Alicia do a little bit of an introduction, and then we will get right into it. So if you're watching and want to join, by all means, send us a note or comment, and we'll have a portion of today's podcast where you can join in. So here's Alicia and Roman.
Hi, everyone. As Jordan mentioned, I'm Alicia Buckley. I am the Center for Indigenous Women, Two-Spirit and Gender Diversity Program Director here at the Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan. I'm a member of the Buffalo River Dene Nation, but I'm definitely an urban Indigenous person as I live and work and grew up in and around Saskatoon.
Thanks, Alicia.
Roman. Don't say Gaganowiak. Roman Young did this Nicholson, Muskaki, no, what's in Nina, which a Osaka. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Roman Young. I am Two-Spirit Swampy Cree from Shoal Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory. I am an intergenerational survivor of the Indian residential school system, and my background is in psychology, and I am the program coordinator for this Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan Center for Indigenous Women, Two-Spirit, and Gender Diversity. And I'm happy to join you today.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about racism and cultural safety. So Alicia, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this. So through the Honoring Her Spark project, what barriers around cultural safety did you hear? And maybe just give our viewers a little bit of a background in terms of what cultural safety means.
For sure. So through the Honoring Her Spark project, we went around and did lots of engagements throughout the province and at our friendship centers to kind of discuss the barriers and the needs of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people in our province. So when we're talking about cultural safety, it stems from racism. So that was the number one barrier that we saw that came out over and over in all the engagements that we've done with our office. So it's just an interesting kind of way of saying cultural safety, as much as it deals with racism. One of our steering members of this project mentioned that it's also about the anti-racism training and the cultural humility training, which is also forgotten. So it's a term that was coined out of New Zealand to be a little bit more of an easier term other than racism, because it's such a hard conversation. But when we're talking about racism, there are different forms. It can be institutional, it can be systemic, personal. But what we're really going to talk about today is about the ideological and the representational racism. So when we're talking about ideological, we're talking about those comments that come up saying all Asians are smart, or all natives are drunk, Latinos are fiery. But what we're gonna talk again, I'm saying is representational of cultural appropriation. That's the Edmonton Eskimos using the sign or the word Eskimo. Those are the Pocahontas costumes that we see. That's where we're talking about racism, and how do we make that a drunk, Latinos are fiery. but we're gonna talk again a little bit of a representational of cultural appropriation problem. Sorry about this. It happens.
Okay, sorry. Keep going.
Anyways, I wanted to share a little bit about the barriers that we noticed. So I did mention that discrimination was the number one, with racism being at the top. But we're also talking about cultural barriers. People have a loss of culture. People are also craving access to culture. In Saskatchewan, there's so many different Indigenous cultures that we also see divisions and traditions. So whether one culture allows women to drum versus another culture that doesn't, things like that. We're also seeing major losses of language, or how Jordan lives a balance of two worlds. So living an urban society today versus a very traditional northern kind of culture. So having that balance is very difficult for people. So I commend Jordan for saying that.
Stilettos to moccasins. I saw a program called that once. I was like, hey, I can identify.
And then this all comes from colonialism. Indigenous people have faced a huge loss of cultural genocide, or talking about intergenerational traumas. I say over and over that it took 7 generations to get here, 7 generations of trauma, and it's going to take 7 generations to heal from it. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about cultural safety, I think that's one of the biggest learning curves is everybody needs to realize is that it's not going to take overnight. Reconciliation is something, it seems to be a buzzword for some people, or it seems to be a true meaning of life for others. So it's seeing where everybody's at and how do we move forward together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think that all of the work that Honoring Her Spark has done, like there's so many resources and connections and valuable information that people can take from that. So again, I've got to plug Honoring Her Spark and the work that you guys have done at AFCS to bring all of this information together. So thank you for that introduction, Alicia. If people have questions, like the comment section is open. If you have more questions or want us to elaborate a little bit further on cultural safety, by all means, send those questions in. Okay. So some of those barriers that were mentioned, I guess, were discrimination, cultural barriers, and colonialism. I'd like to start on those topics if we can. So discrimination being at the top with racism. So maybe we want to share kind of some of our own personal stories, or I guess professional stories, maybe in terms of discrimination and what we mean by that, and how we have experienced that as Indigenous people and Indigenous organizations. So maybe Roman or Alicia, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Go for it, Roman.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I think Alicia did a good job, like giving a brief overview of our discussion today, but I just wanted to add on a little bit of what she said in terms of I really like when she said when she talked about intergenerational trauma, mm-hmm. and how it's going to take 7 generations to heal, 7 generations of trauma to heal from, right? Mm-hmm. I read somewhere in one of my resources I used for one of my research papers, where it talked about healing, like Alicia said, it's going to take a lot of generations to achieve. Mm-hmm. But in terms of healing, it also includes dismantling a system, and I feel like we're going to talk about that a little bit. But I just wanted to take a quote directly from my research paper where it said, in a way, healing involves dismantling generations of trauma, and that also includes dismantling a system like a system that has discriminated against Indigenous people for many, many years. And I feel like that's healing in some aspects has to do with like dismantling the system, right? And that's where that term decolonizing or indigenizing comes in. But in terms of my own personal experiences with cultural barrier and colonialism would be, I feel like in terms of like cultural discrimination, one of the answers I gave out in a webinar I did with anti, like the discussion around anti-racism was, in terms of being discriminated based on my own culture, it was the fact that in terms of privilege, my culture and my identity wasn't, say, how do I say this? Like, Indigenous history wasn't part of like the mainstream curriculum. And that was one of the issues I found I struggled with when I was like, say, for example, on my professional education journey, was like growing up in a system where I myself as an Indigenous person wasn't recognized, right? Yeah. So I think that's one of the examples I can think of from the top of my head. And of course, with colonialism, being an intergenerational survivor has affected me and my family way before I was born, and I still feel like it's gonna continue becoming a barrier unless we, like I said, take steps to heal and dismantle and decolonize or indigenize a system that, like I said, discriminated Indigenous people for many years.
So okay, let's talk about so you talk about dismantling systems, and automatically I'm thinking of like, you know, government systems and like institutions and all of those entities, but also on a personal level, you know, decolonizing within ourselves, right? The power that we have on a day-to-day and like moment-to-moment kind of capacity is to be able to look at our own patterns and our own internal systems, right? And we have these thoughts like Harold Johnson talks about this a little bit, in how, you know, you're walking down the street. And, you know, I've caught myself doing this, and I've went through the whole like guilt and disgust almost with my own thoughts and how, but it's almost like ingrained in us in how society likes to think of people based on class and race and gender, all of these different things, sexuality, right? So you're walking down the street and you see like, an Indigenous person, let's say, sitting on the street, and it's like you said, Alicia, you know, we have that those thoughts of like, oh, that Indian person is drunk. And, you know, there's been occasions where I worked as a server, and it was like, man, it's like 40 below, and there's people like passing out outside, and it's like, oh, they're just drunks. It's like, no, they might have hypothermia and they're like falling asleep from this. They're not drunk, you know, but we have these thoughts that just, the first instinct is to think these things. And we always have to consciously be working. And some of us are a little bit better and more aware and open to making those changes and being okay with the fact that, like, yeah, that's a messed up thought and that's in my head, but I have the power to change that, you know? So I think first step for everybody is like being willing to accept the fact that we are not perfect, and we have these thoughts that are kind of, you know, that have been molded into our brains, into our being because of the society that we live in. And you look at where we are in Canada and in the world, like, you know, we're a fully developed country, but our Indigenous nations, many of them are living in third world conditions, you know, like we have this image or persona that everything's like okay, you know, and so as people, as individuals, everything should be okay, and those thoughts should just be like brushed aside or not taken into account. but it's like, no, man, those are the ways that we're decolonizing and actively being a part of that solution and changing the way that these systems are built. And so I appreciate, like the work that you've done in university to kind of recognize that. And in that, you look at the institution that you exist in, right? Even your existence within that institution is decolonizing and dismantling. Yeah, I love that talk of like dismantling systems, because we within ourselves have to break those cycles.
Yeah, and I really want to, like, as much as we're talking about racism and cultural safety, we need to move forward together. So that was the first step, is to be able to check our own biases, realize our own privilege, and see how we can make a difference in the next generation that we leave the world in. You're talking to, we're talking about decolonizing, but when we're talking about racism, the tokenisms that happen all the time and those biases that we see. I know in preparing for the podcast, we discussed human zoos, for example. So not too far off, there were human zoos where you could see Indigenous, mainly Inuit people, in a zoo-like setting where white folks could come pay a fee and see Inuit people in their own habitat, just like at a zoo. It's pretty astounding that this didn't even happen 100 years ago, let alone 60 years ago. One of our colleagues we work with, he's Inuit. He went to New York as a youth for the United Nations, and he actually went to a museum in New York and saw one of his regalia as an Inuit person hanging up in the museum, and it was actually from his hometown. He's like, this is not meant to be in a museum. This is supposed to be at home. How did they get their hands on this? Another thing that I've noticed, I'm the past president of Heritage Saskatchewan, and we're talking about one of the biggest issues is decolonizing, and what does this look like, including the John A. Macdonald statues. How people are ripping them down or painting them red. One of the things that we keep reiterating is we're talking about cultural safety. It's about that education piece behind it. That's the next step as we move forward. We need to all realize our shared history. We need to realize the history of the land that we live on and the people that have given us the land. So all of our generations previous. We need to acknowledge it. And we need to move forward together. So it's not about tearing down the statue or vandalizing it. It's about, how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? How do we commemorate and honor those who have been victims to it, who still intergenerationally feel that trauma? How do we help heal for each other and reconcile this? So that's one of the biggest things, is as much as people are tearing down statues or being having anti-hate crime, which is a crime in itself, how do we move forward together? So that's one thing I just wanted to pinpoint about when we're talking about cultural appropriation. We need to see the issues but we also need to move forward.
Yeah, I think this podcast was scheduled for last week, but I think it falls on a pretty interesting day in history. I think, and we're not American, but today is a pretty impactful day, I think, globally for people, especially people of color, Indigenous people and Black people. And like,
you're talking about my birthday, right? It is my birthday today, don't you know?
Oh yeah, it's your birthday.
Not about the American election or anything, about my birthday.
Yeah, it's Alicia's birthday. Okay, so Roman at the end of this podcast is gonna sing happy birthday to Alicia. I'm just kidding. How would that even go? I don't know. Anyways, if we have a viewer that can sing happy birthday in Cree or Dene or anything, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, today is like the American presidential election. which will definitely impact us. And I think one of the things that, this last term for Trump has really like brought out is people's openness and like they're just overt racism that has come out, but also like with that, it's like, like people were talking about this like years and years and years ago, but not to the level and the like depth and breadth that people are talking about cultural safety now. Like, and we talked about this in our meeting last week. We had an interesting discussion with the chief of police here in Saskatoon with the Saskatoon Indigenous Community Action Partnership was, how do people feel safe in a place or in a setting or in a society where, things are not built for people, but people can't even feel okay to be who they are, like, and I think in Canada, Saskatchewan is an especially different place. Like we just had our provincial election, and the values and all of the underlying things that exist behind elections and motives and the campaigns and platforms of everyone running, like you feel so much tension. And I don't know if you guys are on the same page as me, but like there's just this like air about things when elections happen, and I can't imagine what it's like in the States right now where, it really is a battle of color. Like it's such a troubling thing and troubling time, I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that and kind of how, even just the society and our perception and the discussions that we have like day to day, whether it's in the coffee room or, in professional settings, like how that really impacts people and how we work together? It's kind of a loaded question.
It was a lot of really good topics, and like it was really good though. But one of the things like I wanted to comment on was when you were sharing your experiences when you were working as a server, and when you would hear comments about like there's like a drunk Indian passed out outside. My first thought that came to mind when you mentioned that was like, well, first of all, people are so quick to use race as a label and to label people, whether it's like good or bad. But also, they're also quick to use race as a label to also, I guess, label like other issues that have nothing to do with race. So what I'm saying is like, people are so quick to use like say racism as an example without like to you people are quick to put a connection between race and say substance abuse as like they're related, right, without realizing that issues like say racism, I'll use another example, issues like say violence, substance abuse, mental health don't discriminate based on racism, if that makes sense, right? These are all issues that affect everyone, regardless if you're native or not, right? But because like we live in a society where that's all we saw for like many years was like drunk Indians on the street, is like we were quick to put two and two together without realizing like alcoholism, substance abuse, mental health, violence affects everyone. Right. So, but yeah, that's just one of the things that came to mind when you were sharing your experiences on being a server. So,
I think like on that note, and I kind of want to be very careful with what I say because this could come out wrong, but I think being Indigenous does not mean you are predisposed to being an alcoholic, right? Like I think that's what you're trying to say. And but we also do see alcoholism very prevalent in many of our communities. It is a very real issue, you know? And I think, yeah, just to kind of further elaborate on what you're saying, it's just like, people don't actually stop to ask questions of like, why, you know, like, why does that exist? And where did that all stem from, you know? And I don't think people ask the question because they know that it would be a lot of work to unpack all of that, and it would take some learning, you know, and I don't know if people are willing to learn and take the time and really truly care about, you know, what that means. But I think to speak in terms of like the general public, like to actually care and unpack and learn about all of that, that impacts everybody, like economically, the world of health, justice, it affects everybody, right? Like when I used to play volleyball, you know, and like you're only as strong as your weakest player. And, you know, if we don't like work to bring everybody up to like create equity for those, you know, people that are struggling, or communities, or, you know, kind of some of the areas where we need more support, then like we can't really advance as a people, right? As a collective. And yeah, I'm not quite sure going with that one, but
and I think you're on a really good path when we're talking about like the economics, right? We're Honoring Her Spark is the first Indigenous women's economic framework, but we look at everything holistically. And that's the lens that Indigenous women especially have to be able to do that. We're talking about tokenizing. Somebody asked us last week, Jordan and I, what's the difference between appropriation of a culture and using it and celebrating it? So let's think of beading earrings. Good point. How, when a non-Indigenous person buys a pair of earrings, what is that? What does that mean? When does it become a purchase versus a cultural honoring? So we're thinking about it like it's more about the education behind it. What does it take to go into the beading? Is it made out of hide? Where did the hide come from? How many hours did it take to hunt down that moose or that deer? The hours it took to learn about beading and then be able to pass that knowledge on. The hours it took to find the materials and create something beautiful, the meaning of what it represents. So if it's a beaded or even a painting of a white buffalo, what does that mean? What's the significance behind it in a cultural sense? So it's taking the time to learn about this, seeing where it's actually sourced from. So are the earrings that you bought commercially and industrially made, where they're just kind of off the...
I think so. They don't smell like hide.
Or are they somebody who took the time, an artisan, to create something beautiful to sell their wares? And then also looking if it's being sold at the equivalent of what was made. So if it's something that a beater and a hunter took the time to go and do this, is it being sold for the right amount? So it's really moving from that buying and wearing to learning about the education. So I think that's where we need to focus on it. And when you're talking about like the provincial election or the American election, again, it's that education. This is the platform that we can use to really push that education piece.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the reason I brought up economics is I think that's often like a driving force of any political campaign or platform, right? Is everybody wants economic prosperity, and like, what does that actually mean, and how are people meaningfully included in that? And so to try to speak the language of the general public, you know, I think in terms of, economic wealth and equity, like, these are definitely huge things. And we talk about, you're talking about earrings and beadwork. Like, she's talking about like cookums from like Kayas, learning from their cookums how to bead, like, you know, that's like 100 years of teachings passed down. Like I look at my friend Giselle, I am a little bit addicted to her her beadwork, and you know, she learned how to bead from her Setsuna, which is her grandmother. You know this, Alicia, your Dene. So she learned to bead from her Setsuna, and she passed a few years ago. So she now has that, and she's 29 years old. Her mom and dad and her sister and her all prepare the hide, and which takes like a week at least, you know, not including the hunt and going to buy the gas, going to gas up the truck, gassing up the quad, taking the quad out to their super secret spot that their family has been hunting for years and years and years and years and years, you know? So it's like, next time you go buy some beadwork and you question that price, like actually think about the cost. Like think about what it took, what all of that hard work that went into that. Yeah, I love that topic. It's huge and something that people don't often think about. And it's like, man, you'd go buy a freaking Gucci belt for $500 and not question where that metal and plastic came from. But when we talk about moose hide and beadwork, like we devalue it. But I think that takes us to our next topic, which Halloween just passed, and I saw so many amazing TikTokers that were posting all of these educational TikToks on like, no, you don't get to be a Pocahontas princess with your little sexy outfit. Like, and you know, this is why this is wrong. So I saw a lot more education on social media, which was really, really cool. But one of the things that we were discussing that would be an important topic is like, what's often brought up is like headdresses, you know, and on Halloween, like this is why you don't wear a headdress because it's like for chiefs or leaders of communities, right? But we don't often look at that regalia piece or that like the cultural piece of all of those components, like, you know, Giselle Setsuna teaching her all of that work, like that's all a part of it as well. That's a part of what that means. It's not just like a level of hierarchy in a community. It's the value behind Indigenous workmanship, really. Yeah, it's just, you know, and I guess that goes into a little bit of, the value of Indigenous teachings, Indigenous knowledge, and what that is, right? Like we tokenize that a lot of the time when it's convenient, you know. We always want elders to speak at events. And do you guys see that? So through AFCS, because you're I guess a predominantly Indigenous, would you say you're an Indigenous organization? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
Aboriginal Friendship Center. Sorry.
We see it all the time where an elder is asked to say a prayer at a large gathering or an event, and then they're like, "Here's your check. Okay, you're free to go." Well, that's not what an elder is meant to do. Think of it this way. Again, I sit on the board of Heritage Saskatchewan. I kind of tried to let them know that tokenizing the only Indigenous board member may not be so great. Like, use the knowledge, use what the guidance comes from. So we're talking about asking elders for a prayer. What does that really mean? Mm-hmm. We're asking for guidance, and depending on, and again, elders are all different. They may or may not accept tobacco. They may or may not accept honoraria. They may or may not want to stay. But it's giving them that option to do so and asking them what their traditional way is. How were they taught? Again, that goes back to the differences in Indigenous cultures, that not all people have the same ideas when it comes to smudging or so it's being able to do that background information and personalizing it. It kind of goes to the whole idea of land acknowledgements. Now it's a normal thing to we're on Treaty 6, homeland of the Métis, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
We need to think about how to personalize it. We need to really truly understand where we are today and how we got here. We're standing on Treaty 6, but we're also standing on traditional lands of Métis, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Cree, Dene, a whole bunch. So we need to understand the generations that came before us and where we stand now and personalize it. I like to kind of mention that I'm a daughter of Treaty 6 and a daughter of Treaty 10. So it's something that I know where I came from, but I also know the land that I stand on now. And I know how to respect Mother Earth and Father Creator for where I am. And again, I think that goes back to the privilege conversation is I'm here because of what happened.
Yeah.
I am who I am, and I can acknowledge my own biases. I can understand where people are coming from, have an open mind.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Sorry if you were hearing background. Can I play a quick video for you guys?
Of course.
Okay, it's so funny. It's a few minutes, but it's absolutely it's incredible. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, here we are. So we're gonna full screen it. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen Baroness von Sketch, but it's an all-female cast, director, like the whole production team, they're all female, and it's hilarious. The humor around some issues that women face or just like people in general. But this is a good one on land acknowledgement.
Hello. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Sorry. Hello. Sorry. Excuse me. Should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh no. I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry. I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that? Or
hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
oh, okay. So some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
A portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh no, that money goes to Nestle. They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry. I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats.
But
Have a good time.
good night. So sit down. Enjoy the show.
That was really good.
Oh man, that cracks me up. Oh, it's so bad. YouTube.
A little bit of dance
That's
music.
Canadian show. So yeah, share that next time you talk about land acknowledgements. That's a funny little resource to have. But yeah, so that's a really interesting thing, hey? And I don't know how you guys feel about that, but this goes into the whole topic of like reconciliation and like meaningful action and meaningful engagement and what that is, right? I think it's very easy to do a land acknowledgement, but like what does that actually mean? And how are you actually doing the work to, let's say, like decolonize or contribute to the people that's land that you're on? And that's not even, I don't even think that's like an Indigenous worldview, that this is our land, right? Like this is the land that we are living on. It's not our land, it's not your land, right? And I think that's like the misconception, and that can lead us into a whole topic on land back if we really wanted to.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I want to add on my 2 cents. Okay. Yeah. In terms of like land acknowledgement, one of the interesting pieces I found in my research was like, well, for me personally, I felt like when we started doing land acknowledgements, after a while, I kind of felt like they were starting to become too generic in a way. They started to sound the same, right? And I started thinking about that when one of my former colleagues approached me asking me how to do a land acknowledgement. And I was stumped because I didn't know how to answer that other than like answering it in terms of like, well, a land acknowledgement is something that has to come from you, right? It's something personal, because like I'm gonna read what I wrote here. Why I felt like it was becoming too generic was like, when it becomes too generic, I feel like it's losing its meaning. It loses its sole purpose, right? It loses why we're there in the first place. And acknowledging the land is like, it's like establishing our connection to the land by means of like recognizing and respecting our roles and responsibilities to the land, right? And setting our intentions and purpose for it. So in a way, it's like asking for permission directly from the land by acknowledging our purpose, right? And that has to come from within each of us. It's unique and specific to each of us, because even though we all have the same purpose, our intentions are unique and different within each other, if that makes sense. And also too, land acknowledgements also enables people to create and restore the natural order, but beyond the natural world, that involves learning about the ancestors and reconnecting with history, which serves as like pillars that help people find, like I said, purpose, right? At the beginning, we start by acknowledging the land, and through this, we are conceptualizing, or we're sharing our own ideas on what we feel our relationship to the land should be. And right at the beginning, we're basically taught the importance of respecting and acknowledging the land, but also respecting and acknowledging our place in the natural world, right? So
I like that. So you made me think of indigenization, and that's one of the other topics that we really wanted to get into, and kind of what that means, and just like unpacking that a little bit. So I guess I'll put that on you guys. What do you think, like in terms of an organizational perspective, and like I guess you come from you refer a lot to the research and education system that you studied at Roman. So from like an educational institutional viewpoint on indigenization, and then Alicia maybe from more of an organizational viewpoint on indigenization. But I can start a little on that. And I think, I used to work at a college, and one of the things that we wanted to do at the college, because we got some really incredible feedback that, if I were blindfolded and dropped into this institution, I wouldn't really know where on earth I was. unless I were able to look at the people and say, okay, there's a lot of brown faces here. I think, we might be in an Indigenous community. But there was not really any culture, we didn't have the vibrancy of indigeneity ingrained in that institution. And so I think we see this in a lot of places, right? And so my task was to travel and work with communities on how do we create an environment now where people want to study. Indigenous people want to come here and be here and stay here, right? Student retention is a huge thing. And I think that goes hand in hand with cultural safety. And are we actually providing an environment that is conducive for learning and just for existing, really? And so the topic of indigenization was one thing that I asked many places was, what does that mean to you? And from a personal and community perspective, but also at an organizational level, how are the stakeholders that we work with willing to do that? And how are they doing that? What steps are we taking, So yeah, I'd like to hear more from you guys. I honestly, after my travels, I got back with more questions than I had left with, and I felt a little more confused. So, but I think that is the process of learning, right? We always like to come back with more questions, and that means that there's more learning to be had. So that's good. But yeah, I'd love to hear your insight on indigenization.
Well, I think it goes back to that balance of walking in two worlds. So the Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan, our primary role is to advocate and support for our friendship centers in Saskatchewan. But the secondary role is then supporting our urban Indigenous people across the province. It's one thing to put some art up in your office, but it's another thing to where did that art come from? Who made it? Is it bought and sold in a way that does benefit both? So when we're talking about indigenization, we're talking about what's that cultural meeting. One of the biggest things that we have in our partnerships that we're trying to move forward against, walking in two worlds, is the reciprocity. Indigenous cultures are sold. There was no capitalism. It's all reciprocity. So how do partnerships do mutually beneficial to both organizations? How do we ensure that we're being respectful to both organizations, but being able to still do the work that we're doing in a way that benefits our people. We also need to know that it's about processes, right? Through Honoring Her Spark, we have a steering committee. Most of them are Indigenous women. Some of them are just women. But it's building that capacity. We need to learn the stories. We need to take that narrative. And I think that's one of the hardest things, is to learn the stories, take that narrative and make it into something that we can take as an organization, into data, into stats, and how do we prioritize supports. So I think it's again about those processes. We have a steering committee that is able to guide us in the right direction. We use our elders to ensure that we're doing things culturally appropriate. We obviously can do better. Roman mentioned to me the other day, has Honoring Her Spark gone through a ceremony? No, but maybe this is something that we need to look into now that we're starting to implement the framework. Bringing in Indigenous women from across the province and having ceremonies to honor each and every one of our sparks. I think is something that needs to be looked at forward. And this goes not only organizationally, but institutionally, is again, that balance of living in two worlds. How do we make it safe that everybody wants to be in that space? Again, you can put up a painting, you can buy a dream catcher like everybody does. But it's making that place comfortable for any person from any walk of life to come into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And well said, Alicia. Very well said. In terms of like where I'm at with where I'm at professionally and personally, um, with my grad studies, one of the things that we're really encouraged to do more research and to build more research on is to basically develop more culture-based programming, whether it's programming for education, justice, health, and so on, right? But the point is like whatever program we decide to develop and implement, it should be culturally based, right? And so yeah, it should be culturally based because the culture-based healing programs teaches people essential skills and tools to establish relationships amongst themselves, and as I mentioned before, with the land, right? It also helps people move towards a sense of being and holistic wellness, if that makes sense. Another piece too is like consultation is key, right? Consultation in the Indigenous communities is essential. It's important, right? You can't work with Indigenous people unless you consult with a community directly because only they would know what works and what doesn't work for them. So I always stress like consultation, consult. If you're not sure, ask, right? Culture-based healing programs can help people shift these imbalances in their lives, and it encourages them to be more involved in the decision-making process, right? Whether it's for them or whether it's for the community. And it has to be flexible. Working with Indigenous people, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing because, like Alicia said, we are pretty diverse groups of people, right? So being able to be flexible enough to develop and implement whatever it is you're trying to do with the community, being flexible. Let's see what else. And another thing too, sorry, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I wanted to talk about consultation, but finish and then.
Okay, yeah, for sure. And then also too, like Alicia said, bringing lodges and ceremony back is another key thing because like ceremony, we're acknowledging ourselves, our ancestors, and the land through lodges and ceremonies, right? But also too, bringing elders, children, and youth back into the circles, not only as like tokenizing them, bringing an elder in or a youth in or a youth in just to have that representation, but giving them legitimate roles on why we're inviting them back into the circle, right? They can be our teachers, right? Kind of like establishing those roles and connections. What's that? And recognizing too that this is going to be like a continuous process. Healing is very messy, especially in terms of like dismantling or decolonizing a system. It's going to get messy because as we mentioned earlier, it's like we're healing generations of trauma in the process of trying to dismantle a system that discriminated Indigenous people and so on for many years, right? And just also recognizing that this is the Indigenous perspective. This is the only way we know how and understand and are able to teach what we know, right? And recognizing that we all each have our own teachings and beliefs and knowledge. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say right now. I could go on and on, but yeah.
I think you touched on some very important points, and when I think of indigenization, it very much has that same air about it of the land acknowledgement piece of, it's almost like it's something that is done now to like, okay, let's sprinkle a few feathers on here and make it Indigenous. And, you know, it has like that perception that that we care about indigeneity, you know, but it's like, no, let's look at the very foundation of organizations and systems. And is that changing? Have you changed the basis of all of these systems that are created? Like, you would literally have to like uproot everything that has been created at the basis of these things to be able to truly indigenize it, right? Like, it needs to be ground up and not like, okay, let's like trickle down all of these nice little things that we think will work. It's like, you know, creating that environment is actually at the foundation, like the value systems that make up an entity or a business or a person, right? Those things need to change to see something. Like, I can wear earrings all day long and look like I'm Indigenous and act like it and whatever. But if I don't think and feel it, and if I don't exist in that being that way, then it, you know, like, am I truly trying to decolonize and indigenize, so to speak? So yeah, I think that talk of like foundation is very important. And then you also talked about consultation. I do a lot of work in like energy and clean energy and industry, and that's a common thing, is consultation and our duty to consult. And what does that look like? And there's so much talk right now with UNDRIP and what that actually means to people, right? And I think language is such a key thing. And like, you talk about like collaboration, consultation, those things sometimes are now swear words, right? In like, for among Indigenous circles. And it's like, you want to come around here and talk about consultation? Like, there's so many loopholes that organizations and companies take and say they've consulted, right? When it's like, you go and talk to somebody. I remember we talked to a company, this was like way back in an old job, and they were like, oh yeah, we met this one guy and he told us all about the community and the needs of the community. And it's like, oh cool, you talked to one guy, that's like real meaningful, real deadly work you're doing. Like, no, that's not, you know. And so when we talk about language, like consultation, what does that actually mean to a community? And what does that mean to the organization? And how do they translate that in, you know, the reporting and the existence of their company, right? So yeah, it's just very important to like be on the same level of understanding. Like, look at the treaties, for example. Pretty sure we didn't sign up for a bag of flour and $5. Like, that was not our understanding of what that agreement was, right? That was a type of consultation that very much did not work in favor. So I am a little cognizant of time. We are coming up to the 1 hour point, but we have some very important points that I think can be discussed still. I think maybe if we just talked a little bit about like honoring her spark and some of those barriers, and I guess like resources or takeaways for people. You know, we did this wonderful initiative. I was invited by Alicia to be a part of the Honoring Her Spark. I don't know what you would call it, like a speaker series or vignettes.
Well, we're calling them vignettes, but what we're doing to, obviously COVID has impacted everybody, and the project kind of went on a huge standstill. So we filmed 12 very inspirational Indigenous women from across the province. It was interesting because we asked, what are your barriers and where are you today? And Jordan, you mentioned it, it's so easy to go to that mindset where we noticed, Roman and I, every single woman was easy enough to say, my barriers, I've overcome blank, blank, blank. But when it came to where am I today, that's where people stumbled on. We're so focused on those hard issues that we're not seeing and celebrating who we are, which is part of the framework and part of what we need to do next is really honor everybody's sparks that we have inside of us, empower, show that we are more capable than people think, that we're not just the drunk Indians on the side of the road. That when we're talking about these barriers, there are 20 that we identified, but there's many more, like there are 20 categories. But you're talking about the needs as well, and how do we move forward? So it was really funny, Roman kept mentioning flexibility. Support and flexibility was the number one need. That again looks different to everybody at different times. I need support getting my kid ready in the morning versus I need something at work, having that flexibility at any given moment, which is the basis of cultural safety. Making sure that we are flexible enough and have the different capabilities of supporting people in a holistic manner. So the framework, as much as it's an economic framework, we looked at the medicine wheel, we looked at how we can balance everybody and see where we can move forward. And economic prosperity, when you're talking about, it was just interesting how you mentioned what economic prosperity is, and using that language for women, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people is very different. We don't want big mansions. We asked what's economic security and what's economic prosperity. Economic security literally is just how do we ensure that we are healthy, that our families are taken care of. Economic prosperity is going beyond that, just giving back to your community. It's very holistic. It's very ceremonial. It's very Indigenous. So when you're talking about indigenizing, that is the true meaning, giving back. So I think that's a good place maybe to end. Moving forward, that when we're economically prosperous, we're giving back in any way possible.
I love that. And I think that's exactly what this initiative is, right? It's a way to give back to especially women and Two-Spirited folks that, give so much always. Like women are very much, and Two-Spirited people are very much that way, that we're always trying to give and not a lot of taking. And I think this is a way to give back to women in community. So I want to honor you guys and say thank you and Kanaskumtin. Mercy Cho. I think the work that this is doing, this has created and really provided a platform for all of this beautiful work to be showcased and honored. So good job, you guys. I really enjoyed our discussion. We have a few notes here, a few comments. Happy birthday.
Thanks, Russell.
And then we have
Judy. Oh, thank you, Judy.
And then Vicky, thank you for the insightful dialogue, listening while I work from home. Very exciting. So we hope our viewers will join us again, and we'll put out another poster of the upcoming date. We have some very, very exciting topics and guests coming up. So we hope that you join us again. And be sure to check out Honoring Her Spark on YouTube, on all the socials, and hit up Alicia for one of the Honoring Her Spark books.
Do we want to maybe, I think what we can do is maybe a little bit of a prize. So people who maybe, how do you want to do this, Jordan? We can give out a prize, maybe a couple prizes for people who maybe like and
share our next podcast.
Sure.
Poster.
Yeah.
Or do you want to do it on this one to like and share this podcast?
Maybe this one. That way we can do another one for the next one.
Okay. Oh, more prizes. Look at this. She's just Oprah. A prize for you. A prize for you. It's her birthday. She's feeling extra generous. So, okay. We're going to do a like and a share of this video. And yeah, you'll be entered in the draw. So if there are other links that are floating around on Facebook, go to the AFCS page and share the link from the AFCS page, because that's how we'll track it. So if I have mine on my page, don't share that one. Share the one on AFCS. Okay.
Sounds good.
Will be entered to win, and we'll also post this and kind of the rules on the page. But yeah, now we have Roman Young taking it away with a happy birthday song for Alicia.
You don't have to. It's fine.
I'll pass. I'll sing it to her after this is over in her office where nobody can hear and see us. Just kidding now.
Okay, well, happy birthday, Alicia. What a wonderful day to spend your birthday. And thank you to everybody that tuned in and that is going to tune in later. And thanks, Roman, for joining us today. It was very, very insightful. And I'd love to see your research and some of the work you've done. Sounds very
For
interesting.
sure. Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. So. And
Awesome.
now a podcaster. So I'm kidding.
Oh, yeah. Podcaster. Yes.
Yeah, no, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Have a great day.